You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're excited to welcome Dr. Sarah Shultz, an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Shultz is a leading autism researcher focusing on its neural and behavioral origins. Her work at Marcus Autism Center uses neuroimaging techniques to improve early identification and intervention. She also leads several NIH-funded projects on brain development in infants and children. Today, we'll be discussing her research on early autism intervention. Welcome, Dr. Sarah Shultz.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, I appreciate you coming on because this is one of the topics where we get to really start at the beginnings. We get to really start to help families understand where things are starting and how they progress through their child's development. But before we go there, this is such a unique niche to be able to start studying younger children. So what sparked that interest into autism in early infancy for you?
Oh, sure. So I think my interest in infancy really dates back to my undergrad years. So at that time, I was volunteering in a research lab that was studying infant development. It didn't have a particular focus on autism. It was really trying to just understand how infants grow and learn. And the main focus in that lab was studying infant attention to human speech and really building on a lot of super fascinating findings that infants from the first moments of life have preferences for listening to speech compared to all the other millions of sounds in their environment. And so I was working in that lab and working with really young babies and just being so fascinated by, how do they already have this interest or focus on this super socially relevant signal? And picking up the little babies and noticing that they would give me eye contact and they would look between me and mom as we were talking, even though they're only a few months old. And just kind of by a stroke of luck, at the same time, I was given an opportunity to work with a child on the spectrum. He was about 4 years old at the time, was a family friend, and I was tasked with kind of playing with him after school and just kind of giving him a nice supportive environment and maybe kind of incorporating some of what he was working on in his early intervention program just in play. And I was really struck by the differences between some of what I was seeing in the lab with those little babies and what he was working on. So he was really, some of his learning targets were how to make eye contact. And, we were using kind of really creative strategies to capture his attention. And then I would go back in the lab the next day and meet a little 3-month-old who could so kind of almost effortlessly deploy that eye contact and attention. And it really got me thinking about, what is happening in early infancy that some of these things are online in such early ages and need to be approached in such a different way for some individuals on the spectrum. And so really trying to think about what are those building blocks of social learning and how might they unfold differently in autism? And if I had a magic wand to kind of go back to that little 4-year-old and rewind and see what his world was like as an infant, and really try to understand how some early emerging differences could culminate in some of the features of autism. So that was my kind of moment where I got really interested in some of these questions.
Yeah, that wand that you're asking for, I'm sure that every family is asking for at the same time, because oftentimes when I talk with families, especially when they have numerous children, is that one of the first characteristics of, hey, my child might be developing differently than maybe some of my other children, is that lack of attention to social situations, communication being the most important one at that age of, am I actually attuning to the parent who's talking to me right now?
Yeah.
So that makes a very clear delineation from what your original study was to falling into autism. But you just did a recent paper. And I'd love to just kind of understand before we get into kind of the conversation of, where everything went. I'd like to know a little bit about that study
Sure.
And maybe that'll guide a little bit more into, how families are seeing development and being able to observe it and understand a little bit more as their child goes through infancy.
Absolutely. So, the study that you're referring to was a recent study we did where we were following infants who we considered to be at increased likelihood of later receiving an autism diagnosis. So, I mentioned that idea of like, if I had had a magic wand and could have gone back and seen what his sort of experience was like as an infant. We, of course, don't have that magic wand, but there is a type of study design that we often use to try to get some insight into what infant development looks like in children who have autism. And the way we do that is something we refer to as a baby sibling study design. So, because autism has a strong genetic component, if an infant has a first degree relative with autism, then they themselves have a 1 in 5 chance of also later receiving an autism diagnosis. And so, in this research, we study infants from birth. We collect a lot of different measures from them. And then when they reach the toddler years, they get a full diagnostic assessment. And then we can go back and see if we notice any early differences between those infants who later received a diagnosis of autism and those who didn't. So that's our kind of window into how autism unfolds in early
Hmm.
infancy. And so in this particular study, we were really interested in understanding different aspects of how infants and caregivers interact with one another. And the reason we're so interested in infant caregiver interactions is because those interactions are so foundational for social learning. Even though parents might not think about this all the time, parents are so amazing at responding to their infant's signals in ways that meet their infant's needs, that are very reinforcing, but that also scaffold their infant's emerging skills, meaning parents are really good at kind of reinforcing the things that are sort of approximating infant social skills and development and helping bring them to the next level.
Hmm.
Again, all kind of intuitively, like no one's kind of thinking, today I'm going to try responding in this way, but just they do so very naturally. And so we really wanted to understand how those interactions might unfold differently amongst those infants who later receive an autism diagnosis. And so one of the things that we were thinking about is that if there are some early, even subtle differences in infant social ability for those infants who later receive that diagnosis, this might be something that parents are picking up on at some level, right? We respond to our infants in ways that match their current developmental skills and abilities. So if there are any early emerging differences in that realm, we might expect parents to kind of respond or engage differently to their infants. And so we looked at a particular parenting behavior that we refer to as caregiver greeting.
Hmm.
And it's basically kind of what a lot of parents do when they first see their infant. You see this widening of the eyes, opening of the mouth, this really pronounced kind of like, hi, baby, sort of facial expression. And it's a very emotive expression. And it actually plays a really important role in scaffolding social interaction. So when you see that greening and actually increases attention on the part of the infant, it identifies the infant as the parent's kind of intended communicative partner, and it increases the likelihood that the infant will attend to and learn from subsequently presented information. So it's really an
Hmm.
important tool for kind of establishing that interaction. But we thought, for really, really young babies, caregivers might not do that. It might not be a super great way to engage a newborn infant, for example, who's not yet developmentally ready to respond to that really intense social bid, right? You might see parents start doing this more often when their child has reached the age developmentally when they're able to reciprocate to that kind of bid for social interaction.
Hmm.
That's exactly what we found amongst the caregivers of infants who did not have autism diagnoses. So caregivers were much more likely to start greeting when their infants reach that 2 month mark, where they're able to start kind of smiling in response to these things and kind of engaging a little bit more. But it was not very common in very early infancy. And what we found amongst our caregivers of infants who were later diagnosed with autism is that greeting started to happen a little bit later in infancy and in general less often.
Hmm.
And so one thing I want to be super, super clear on when I describe this finding to anybody is that we're not in any way interpreting these results as reflecting anything suboptimal on the part of the caregivers of infants later diagnosed with
Yeah.
autism. What we're really saying is that caregivers are so sensitive to their baby's current developmental stage and needs that they are really adapting their own behavior to meet their baby where they're at. And so,
Yeah.
what this said to us is that even though parents might not be consciously aware of this, they are fine tuning their behavior week by week to match the emerging skills of their babies. And through that lens, we can already see these early signs, these early differences amongst those infants who are later diagnosed with autism.
Is there also like a subconscious component of, I'm as an adult, if I'm communicating with a child and I'm not getting any
Yes.
reciprocity, is that it's not reinforcing for me. It's so I'm going to do what is more reinforcing, which might be just
Mhm.
taking care of the child, not
Yeah,
looking for those other pieces of social interaction. Is there some of
absolutely.
that?
Absolutely. And I think that's, again, completely natural and expected for someone to kind of, even at a subconscious level, feel like, I'm not really gaining any traction through this strategy. Let me
Hmm.
try something else. And I think that, a really um, common form of early intervention and supports for very young children showing signs of autism is parent mediated intervention. And
Hmm.
one of the big components of that is almost like being the parent's cheerleader to say, I know you're feeling this way. It's natural for you to feel this way. You're getting these signals that this is not an inroad into engaging with your child.
Yeah,
Let us give you some extra strategies to help gain that traction and to be your cheerleader to kind of help you persevere through this and try to establish that connection. So
absolutely.
yeah, I think that's a big component. I also think we can learn a lot from these parents and their interactions because perhaps kind of those modes of communication or modes of trying to engage that we see in infants without autism might not be getting the same traction. Maybe something else is. And so trying
Hmm.
to find out what is getting those responses from those infants can actually be really valuable too. Maybe there's some alternative ways of engaging that we can learn from studying these interactions.
Yeah, I mean, that's so powerful because most of the research that's been done has been almost on remediating skills that might not
Right.
have developed during that time period. So we're not talking about what you're discussing right now on can we actually start intervening at
Hmm.
an earlier age and create some of those social development skills before they become barriers to
Right.
other components of somebody's growth and experience. But you
Hmm.
spoke about the parent education component, and it feels like it's both ways. They're educating us as clinicians
Yes.
and researchers at the same time as maybe we're helping to educate. But what are some of the other components? And maybe you can illustrate a little bit of, what that might even look like. Is that you talked about, just that initial interaction of, are they
Hmm.
are they paying attention to just my attempt to engage?
Right.
But what other things might a parent be working on at that point when they notice any of those deficits to maybe start to create some of those connections?
That's a great question. Some of the things that come to mind, I think we as parents are so good at anticipating and meeting the needs of our kids that, just to give an example, so one of the kind of early signs of autism that we know about in that first year of life is by the time kids are approaching their first birthday, that kind of 9 to 12 month window, we might expect kids to start kind of trying to initiate communication by doing things like showing us something or some gestures starting to come on. And sometimes just offering some communication temptations, they're often referred to, sort of trying to hold yourself back from realizing, like, oh, I know they want their sippy cup right now, but actually giving them a chance to let you know that
Hmm.
can be really helpful ways to kind of build up some of those communication skills. trying to establish a shared agenda with your child or kind of a shared moment of engagement before trying to build on additional skills can be really important too. And there's actually some really great resources that have been worked on by Dr. Amy Weatherby at Florida State University. She has some amazing online tools that parents can access through her site. I think it's Autism Navigator, and just really beautiful video libraries of ways that parents can support their infants' social communication skills. A lot of tips and things to look for are available through those resources. Um, yeah.
And I could see a parent potentially getting not frustrated, but at times impatient through the process of,
Mhm.
I really want my child to want me, to engage me
Yeah.
in the way that I'm hoping. Um, but it sounds like what you're saying is that you're almost trying to be able to utilize a lot more motivation of the child and accepting however they're communicating and then building off of that versus forcing a specific type of communication. Are there
Yeah.
pros and cons that, or it sounds like there might be some cons, but what are the pros of following the child's lead through this process?
I think following the child's lead is really important, and that's often a great way to kind of establish that shared agenda, which is so important for communication. So, for a lot of early intervention approaches, I'm thinking of things like Project Impact, sometimes kind of getting down with your child, imitating what they're doing, joining in on what they're doing can be a really great sort of opening to establish that line of communication. But I think more than, trying to get a certain form of communication is just giving them opportunities to learn the link between their signals and responses in the environment. So giving them that opportunity to realize if I look at you, if I give you that moment of eye contact, or if I raise my finger in that direction, or, some vocalization, some way of letting you know what I want, then something will happen. So it's that link, I think, that is so helpful to really be establishing for kids to learn that my communication has power, that I can
Yeah.
make things happen in the world through the things that I do. I think
Mhm.
that's that foundational piece that can really open things up.
Yeah, I mean, and in my mind, anyways, there's no inappropriate communication at that age.
Hmm.
It's like, hey,
Hmm.
am I getting the attempt at
Right.
communication? And that's a win in itself.
Yes.
But you're studying something that it kind of blows my mind that we didn't get into the research on this
Sure.
a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but by studying this and potentially being able to kind of, identify some of these precursor behaviors to
Hmm.
a slower developmental process or challenges in the developmental process because the
Hmm.
perspective of the child is just different in how they're
Right.
interacting with their environment. Um, what do you see that opening up? I mean, what happens if somebody isn't attuned to this and the child goes through creating their own way of interacting in the environment that maybe becomes more reinforcing for them over time? Does treatment
Hmm.
become harder over the years? Are there more barriers that are created for a child by not recognizing this early?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of evidence for kind of that general principle that if we're able to intervene during periods of, greater neuroplasticity, that can lead to kind of more positive outcomes, whatever, an individual defines as a positive outcome. So I think that's certainly the case. But I think anytime you're trying to support a child, if you can get in there at some of those more foundational skills, those are going to have cascading effects that might be harder to achieve if you're coming in kind of at a later time point without that foundation kind of supporting things. That's not to say that there are not amazing gains made from intervention at earlier ages. There's of course tons of learning and plasticity across the lifespan. But I think there is this kind of exciting possibility that if we could offer supports that might kind of help shape some of those building blocks of learning, that it can, of course, then have those cascading impacts that might be larger than if you kind of offered supports at a later stage.
And that makes a ton of sense. I mean, just even I look at myself is that as soon as I start finding a new behavior that, I'm going to cope with and I'm going to figure out ways to navigate my environment, is that if it isn't something that's super productive long term, I'm missing out on some of the other skills that I could have developed if I had found the right way to
Sure.
to interact with the environment or interact with employees or interact with the world around me.
Hmm.
Um, and it makes sense that a child would be going through the same thing, but those are foundational. Those are skills that help you to
Hmm.
develop so much more as time goes on. Um,
Hmm.
one of the things that kind of immediately popped in my mind as you were talking through this is that you spoke a lot about the caregiver's
Yeah.
recognition of this, but a lot of focus has been on the pediatric world
Right.
being supporters of this process. So where do primary care physicians and pediatricians, where do they fall in this line of helping for the family to start thinking through these questions? Or, I mean, are
Yeah.
there surveys, are there scales that they're using to maybe help promote some of the observations that you're finding in your research?
Absolutely. I think pediatricians are so crucial to this journey for parents. They're the first kind of person that parents go to with their concerns. And so I think that, there are certainly screening tools that pediatricians are using, things like the MChat, as well as simply just chatting through those milestones at well visits and things like that. I think as we gain more and more knowledge of kind of the earliest signs of autism and how early some of those parent concerns emerge. I mean, we know that parents by and large are reporting concerns in their child's first year of life and yet are not kind of getting referred for diagnostic assessments until much later. I think as our knowledge base grows to kind of indicate that, yes, indeed, there are signs, and yes, this indeed is indicative of something, and those feelings that parents have are such a great barometer of that, that pediatricians feel more comfortable kind of making those early referrals. I think also, I would imagine one challenge facing pediatricians is often like, what are the supports for really young children? And so I think that as we kind of continue to shore up what those supports look like and what options are available to families, pediatricians will have an easier time making those referrals as well. But I absolutely view them as critical partners to share our findings with, as well as our resources with, in terms of what we can offer to families, because this is a rapidly changing landscape in terms of what's out there for
Mhm.
families of very young children.
Even having those conversations as a parent, you get stuck in, your status quo, what my day is looking like day to day. And sometimes you miss the bigger picture, and having that chance to be able to dialogue with a professional who maybe can, provoke some of those questions and start those
Mhm.
conversations.
Mhm.
It is empowering for the family to, now I have somebody to talk to. If I
Absolutely.
have any concern, at least I have somebody to be able to chat with, and they can either calm my fear
Right.
or educate on where my
Exactly.
concern might lead. Um, Now, you had, I think, indicated that you followed some of these children in your study.
Hmm.
Is that right?
Yes,
So,
yes.
what were some of the findings of, when families did recognize some of these components, or was there any sort of research discoveries that you didn't expect that came out as you were following the children?
Ah, yeah. Well, I would say that, one thing that I didn't necessarily expect, although in hindsight it makes a certain amount of sense, but we were also thinking about like broader sort of context that the family might find themselves in and wondering how that might impact interactions as well. And one of the things we looked at was socioeconomic status, and the measure that we looked at there was family income. So, about a month before the baby was born, we took some data on, family income, as well as some other factors. And we found that family income actually influenced that caregiver greeting behavior that we mentioned. And so that was really interesting to me to think about how the broader context that the family finds themselves in, the resources they have access to, whether that's kind of, financial resources, or even kind of thinking about how that might generalize to sort of psychological resources or just time availability and stressors and things like that, can impact those interactions as well. And the greening behavior we're looking at, it's such a tiny slice of that interaction. It's something parents do in the first seconds of seeing their baby. So already right off the bat, in the first seconds of an interaction, we see that being impacted by both the child's later diagnostic outcome and socioeconomic status. And so that was a bit of an eye opener for me to kind of
Mhm.
see just how fine grained and nuanced some of those effects can be. And made me think about, we're so focused on these parent mediated interventions and, supporting child's social communication, but zooming out to think of the broader context of what other levers can we pull in terms of offering resources to families that might make a difference too. So
Mhm.
that was an interesting one. And I think, as we embark on more and more work on parent mediated intervention, thinking about the caregiver themselves, their family context, stressors, mental health, resources available, all those things are crucial for supporting families.
Absolutely. And I think you see that across healthcare as underserved, under-resourced
Yeah.
communities, is that it's this cascading effect of,
Yes.
am I able to apply everything that I'm hoping to be able to do into all communities appropriately? And you have to be
Yes.
creative to figure out solutions for that. But you did mention family stressors, and that's something that just doing the clinical work is that oftentimes I see is that the family's ability to be able to work through some of the mental health issues that having these strains on one's life. And when you have a unique challenge, which might be my child's not able to communicate with me, is that
Mhm.
creates a lot of pressure, a lot of stress, and more mental health vulnerability as time goes on. And is that
Mhm.
something that you started to see with the families? Is that even if they had maybe the ability to parent without having all those stressors with other children, is that when they had unique challenges, is that you started to see is that they were feeling that more and more as time went on?
Yeah, I actually am working with a student who's looking at data like that right now. So this is unpublished, so please, take this with a grain of salt, but she's been looking at parenting stress indexes over the lifespan of our study and how parent stress changes over time and how it might differ depending on a parent's child's likelihood for autism. So those families who have a first degree relative with autism versus those who don't have that same kind of increased likelihood for autism in their infant, and also how it varies as a function of the child's eventual diagnostic outcome. And you certainly do see between group differences kind of in the direction that you would expect. And you also see some differences emerging over time around those ages where you would be getting that clinical feedback, or perhaps becoming more aware of emerging differences.
Mhm.
So certainly, and one of the areas that my research is heading in that I'm very excited about is really starting to engage with community partners around these issues, particularly caregivers,
Mhm.
and forming, for example, community advisory boards so that as we prepare for our next wave of research on developmental monitoring and early intervention, hearing from parents, what is it like to go through this type of study with your young infant? Do you find it reassuring, or is it really stressful coming in for these visits, knowing that you might get some feedback? Do we feel like partners in this, or,
Mhm.
how can we make this a better experience for you? But also importantly, what information is important for you to know? What questions do you wish we were researching? When do you want feedback? How do you want it delivered? How can we support you? And so I think those things are going to be really important when navigating this kind of new landscape of earlier and earlier identification and intervention.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that there are more of these community advisory boards that bring it across the cross-cultural differences as well, because you're going to experience it differently
Mhm.
depending on your life experience and what it is that are your values and what's important to how your child is being raised. So I can imagine
Mhm.
that influences so much of that partnership that would occur with treatment. Now, you had mentioned of the peer media or the parent mediated intervention.
Hmm.
Um, I would just thinking about the treatment trajectory, and maybe this is how the field of autism is evolving, is that we've gotten pretty good at being able to intervene from age 2 through maybe age 10. And then as we get to adolescence and adulthood, that's a whole new bucket that we still need to get better at as
Yeah.
time goes on.
Hmm.
But this
Hmm.
sounds like a whole different intervention model for the infancy level where parent mediated intervention and almost parent supports as well. So being able to
Hmm.
really give them the facility to be able to kind of emote through the process and have somebody to lean on and have that community is a part that maybe we need to be able to create a funding source for through insurance and get better at
Yeah.
that, but also create a whole treatment or kind of provider network that focuses
Hmm.
on those skills. Is that where you see the evolving nature of treatment for autism? Is we need this bucket just as powerfully as we need all these other buckets, maybe even more so.
I think so. I mean, I think that there are so many wonderful things about parent-mediated interventions in the sense that, it really expands the reach of the intervention to kind of potentially most waking moments of the child's life. Um, a lot of parents provide feedback that it can be really empowering to kind of be able to know how to best support their child. At the same time, it's a huge ask of parents to learn all of this and implement it all the time. And so I think it's really, unfortunately, not going to be successful without taking into account, you know, how this fits into their life, whether it's, cultural differences, resource availability, mental health, all of those things that are going to make or break this as a possible, effective intervention. And so I'm definitely seeing more and more folks really trying to understand how parents' mental health, style of learning, available resources, all of these things need to be considered when creating this plan for parents and figuring out how to best approach this. And so I think, understandably, a lot of the initial work was really focused on the intervention itself and does this even work? And now I think we're able to kind of move towards some of those more kind of implementation aspects of it,
Mhm.
which are really, really crucial.
Yeah, and I mean, especially when you're working through infancy, is that you better really understand the values of that family and those parents, and how to be able to empower them to be the best parent that they possibly can, to
Yeah,
understanding the unique nature of each of their children, and not forcing all
absolutely.
their children to be the same, but instead
Absolutely.
empowering them. So how do you see caregivers and I guess I'll loop providers into this.
Hmm.
How do you see them starting to apply your research into some of those community settings so that they have a chance to be able to start broadening this field and maybe even contributing in the long term to more research opportunities?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I think what our research is really kind of getting at is that, what just that we stand to learn so much from the infancy period. So, the sort of signs and features of autism that we see in toddlerhood, we're not going to see those in infancy, right? Infants are doing totally different things. It's a completely different ball game. But I think what we're finding out about is really how autism unfolds, how you go from a genetic predisposition for autism and how that impacts development over time to eventually result in those features that we call autism. So these things that unfold in infancy can be very subtle. It could be a slight kind of decrease in interest in looking at the faces of other people, a slight, decrease in response to some caregiver bids, all these ways that infants are sort of selecting environments for themselves. We're changing people's, interactions with them in these subtle ways that are going to have accumulative consequences over time. And so I think that just kind of acknowledging development itself and the way it unfolds and really thinking about, you know, really taking seriously what caregivers are saying in terms of the feelings they're having in those interactions, and what they're noticing, and recognizing that we're probably not looking for the same things that we are in toddlerhood, but that those kind of subjective impressions are really, really crucial.
Yeah, and I mean, you had mentioned Project Impact, and when I'm thinking through the process of intervening, if you're
Mhm.
starting to kind of recognize some of those areas where you're saying, if I'm able to empower my child with these skills earlier, then they can start to develop their own way of interacting with the world that's going to be
Mhm.
productive as time goes
Mhm.
on. Um, it sounds like there's different techniques than maybe what clinicians are using, like you said, for toddler on up. Is
Mhm.
this something that, we need to continue to look at the field of the research and the implementation of autism services and start to realize that there's additional trainings that might need to be provided as we're opening up that younger age group and families into service models, and that we need to start honing in on, what's important at that time and what techniques have value versus which ones maybe have value later in life.
Right. Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think a lot of people are doing great work trying to really think about, like, so what does this parent-mediated intervention look like before 9 months of age or even earlier? That's a totally new frontier. There's a lot of people, again, I'll mention Amy Weatherby's group at FSU, who have a model of, offering trainings to other providers as well. So I think there's a lot of really great work happening in this space, and it's an exciting time for sure.
Absolutely. And I mean, along with Amy Weatherby and Project Impact, what other
Mhm.
resources would you be recommending for folks to start their journey of understanding some of these complexities, which obviously as a field we don't completely understand, and you're
Yeah.
helping to add to all everything that's out there in the research and literature. But where would you point others to go to start their education
Yeah.
process?
Well, I know I already mentioned Autism Navigator, but I really do believe that's one of the, most beautiful kind of sets of resources for families because it offers a video library of social communication milestones starting from 2 months of age. So I don't know of too many things that kind of go back that early in life so comprehensively. And built into Autism Navigator are also resources for screening your child and can connect you to direct kind of follow-ups with that FSU team. So there's just a great treasure trove of parent education, intervention resources, signs to look for, where to go for support. So I highly recommend that one. The other thing I'll mention, and I'm sorry, this is probably my own biases being a researcher myself, but research can often be a really great way to gain access to clinical resources as well. And so I mentioned this baby sibling study design that we often utilize. And one of the really nice things about being part of a baby sibs study design is if you have, say, an older child with autism and a young infant, you can enroll your infant in one of these studies, and we would collect new experimental data to try to understand new things about development. But along the way, we also perform many, many clinical assessments, culminating in kind of gold standard autism diagnostic assessments. So, for a parent who is aware of the recurrence rates for their younger sibling, knowing that, there's a 1 in 5 chance my baby will also be on the autism spectrum, a lot of parents really want the opportunity to have their baby prospectively monitored in this way so that if they do have emerging concerns, they have a direct line of access to a clinician who can answer questions and who's also going to be giving them feedback as their baby grows from infancy to toddlerhood. And so there is a consortium of researchers all around the country. It's called the Baby Siblings Research Consortium. They have a website, and that might be a great place to go to try to see, is there a study like this near me? And consider whether that might be a good option for anyone who's interested in kind of that developmental monitoring piece. And then this is also, I think, kind of a newly emerging type of thing, but at the Marcus Autism Center, some clinicians here have opened a baby SIBS clinic. So this is not a research project, but this is an actual clinic that bills to insurance, and it's really for families whose infant is at increased likelihood by virtue of having a first-degree family member with autism. And parents can enroll their child in that clinic regardless of whether they have any active concerns. It's just a prospective monitoring clinic. And so that, looking out for opportunities like that, hopefully more of those types of things will emerge. But I think that that's a nice, it would be nice for families who know that they're at increased likelihood for autism to be able to have kind of a support available to them beyond, kind of waiting to see. So.
Yeah, that wait to see has got to create some additional anxiety, and just having, the supports. A lot of the treatment that's going on is beneficial for any child through their development. So it's just giving extra eyes just to be able to make sure that, we're catching anything that might be a barrier in the future. And I love the fact that Marcus Autism Center is doing that. And I think that's something that a lot of folks should start emulating in the way that they're looking at the treatment models. But Dr. Shultz, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your experience, your research, and contributing to all of this conversation that I think will start to get people talking and creating new models of care and empowering families differently.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on. It was lovely speaking with you.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.